Hello, and welcome to our new podcast series, Open World Learning. I'm Emily Wade.
And I'm Adam Brown.
And we are really excited to be here. We'll be covering lots of different topics as the series develops, from lots of different subjects such as social media, digital learning, gamification, and other things related, which are all things that we're both very passionate about. So we've got some very special things planned. We will have some guest contributors throughout the series that will bring some different perspectives and ideas. And we're also really keen to hear your feedback and ideas for what you would like to see us cover as well. But just to start off with, Adam, you first began looking at gamification some years ago. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I did. I first met a colleague who at the time was an interactive media developer, Danielle Teychenne at Deakin, where we both teach. And we made this really awkward video with us speaking at almost opposite ends of the room. I didn't know anything about framing or anything at that time. It looked like we were kind of socially distancing years in advance. And we made this video about gamification, which Danielle had actually probably discovered before me. And we were still trying to work it out, just almost in conversation. And a year or so after that, in 2016, we both started co-creating a YouTube web series called Our Gamified World. And in a sense, I just thought, as you were speaking then, one of the things we were trying to do there was not only make media for students, because I was teaching in the digital media space, and eventually that kind of grew into a specific unit around gamified media. But we were trying to make media more broadly for teachers, industry practitioners, and other interested people, any lifelong learners. And I was thinking, just as you were speaking then, that's kind of the audience that we're looking at now, that cross-section of, it's not just students who are interested and want to learn this stuff. It's teachers, everyone who's not interested in social media. Even if they hate it, they're kind of interested in it from that perspective. So I think that's a nice synergy between the Our Gamified World web series and what we're trying to do in this podcast, Open World Learning, where we're making media for anyone who's interested. And we're, as you said, we're certainly interested in people's feedback. So I thought one of the ways in which it might be a nice way to move into this podcast, Open World Learning, would be to use a brief section from the first episode of Our Gamified World second season, which answers that very first fundamental question: what is gamification?
We should probably quickly define what gamification is. So gamification is the use of gaming elements in non-gaming contexts.
In other words, gamification is not gaming. And in order to underline this point that gamification is not gaming, I put together a little segment with my canine companion Frank that I like to call Speaking Frankly.
Gamification is not gaming.
This is a game, this is a game, and this is a game. Gamification is different, and this distinction has led to some very strong value judgments between games on the one hand and gamification on the other. In recent years, I've met a number of academic researchers, industry practitioners, and others who really dislike the term gamification and dismiss any application of it as something not to be taken all that seriously. To me, this is a fairly absurd position. Gamification is so broad, any rejection of it like that can only be because of a misunderstanding of what gamification is. I mean, it's like saying that all social media is terrible. Gamification is a massively varied phenomenon, and sure, it can be exploited and misused in unethical ways, and we'll come back to that in a later episode, but the potential value it has for combating the crisis of engagement is there.
So to draw out several points from that clip, as Danielle mentioned there, really the key definition of gamification is applying game elements to non-game contexts. And it is something that's quite simple, really, and often it is everywhere. And until we start talking to students about what gamification is, they might not have considered it before. But once you're aware of it, then you start to see that it is, in fact, everywhere. in a sense. But it's also something that can be confused, or people can be a little bit resistant to it. Have you found that as well?
All the time, both of those things. Everyone always says after they've studied a week or an entire trimester of it, I'm seeing gamification all over the place now. It's so obvious, but it's also not. And that's an interesting thing about the term. We kind of need a term to explain what it is because it's not gaming. You know, I would love to talk about board games, as you know, and I'm sure that you wouldn't love that quite so much, but it's not games. It's not playing games, making games in the same sense as, you know, so game studies and the games industry does, but it is using some components of what they've discovered, and that's just become, you know, ubiquitous. It's all over the place. And I mean, it's probably handy to go into a few examples for people who are maybe listening who are brand new to gamification. One of the examples I love, because of that resistance that you mentioned, you know, people have just, as soon as I've mentioned the word, people shut down sometimes, whether they're researchers, really experienced veteran researchers of game-based learning and all this kind of stuff, or students who just love playing video games. And they're like, that just sounds so boring. Yeah. I don't think, as I said in that little clip, you can criticize something, a phenomenon as a whole. It sounds like saying social media is dumb or stupid or boring or bad as a whole, when you've got something like Duolingo for language learning. Because I used Duolingo a little bit when I was learning some German, but I actually used more an app that was basically pretty much a rip-off of Duolingo at the time. It was before Duolingo had Mandarin on it, called Hello Chinese. And this app, compared to listening to a tutorial or reading a book, it just made it so much easier to get those little sort of bite-sized portions of learning and to motivate myself to keep going. And millions of people around the world are currently using Duolingo and have in the past. So, and you've used that in the past, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. And it is a good comparison to make too, to the older style. I know that in past work, I actually did try and learn German as well, and had it just on CDs in the car at that time. And those extra elements that are added to something like Duolingo, as you said, it really adds that extra motivation. It means you invest a little bit further because you really want to achieve the next stages. And of course, Duolingo has that very cute little owl that really adds to the gamification. It's a personal connection to the app for a lot of people.
Yeah, I remember Danielle talking about how guilty she felt because the owl would send her a notification saying, you haven't kept up with your lessons or something like that.
That's right. It's that emotional connection. We know it works. Yeah.
And it doesn't work for everyone. It doesn't work forever. And that's what I often hear about, especially structural forms of gamification, where they're not as, you know, the immersive kind of narrative based, which takes way more time and money to design and things. But structural gamification isn't supposed to work forever. Like sometimes people seem to expect that it's supposed to be the be all and end all solution that will maintain motivation. Motivation is that, and we'll go into this in probably the next episode, a lot more detail. It's that fickle thing where even during a day, you could say that your motivation fluctuates so much. So it's a great example where you can sort of unpack all of those things. And Duolingo's got, you know, a massive different features and has been used in lots of different settings for lots of things, because it's used to, you know, for translation purposes online as well.
That's right. And I think that for those types of examples where we're talking about structural gamification, it can go a long way to challenging or trying to remedy what we hear. Something we hear about a lot is crises of engagement. So it's so hard to engage people in many different contexts. And, you know, education, learning is one of those. So if you've got one of these programs or applications and it is gamified, then that's a really fantastic tool. As you said, it's not the be all and end all, but it can go a long way to engaging people further than what a non-gamified solution might.
Exactly. The question of why is gamification needed is much more interesting than what is it to me, actually, because that crisis of engagement, I've given a lot of industry presentations in the past where you just say, crisis of engagement as a phrase, and everyone starts to kind of slowly, morosely nod their heads. And everyone kind of knows, everyone from HR who's trying to get people to invest in the media that they're trying to distribute internally, through to educators, you know, everyone, you hear about it. And you don't need to explain that too much as a concept, but just 2 examples from literally the last week or so. I had someone connect with me on LinkedIn, sent me a direct message, who I volunteered alongside with years ago at the Jewish Holocaust Center, which is another whole interesting kind of context of trying to engage people. There was a Holocaust survivor who came up to me once and just asked the most powerful question: how do we reach the young people? And I fumbled for an answer. But this person who messaged me on LinkedIn actually moved to Northern Territory recently, and she's now working in an educational department of some kind. And she had found the Our Gamified World web series and said, just wanted to let you know, really found this useful. She didn't say too much, but she was trying to move from just people around her using PowerPoint. The interesting thing about Microsoft PowerPoint is that you can actually gamify slideshows with links and make an interactive kind of, you know, choose your own adventure thing. I've tried that a few times, but obviously there's more interesting gamified ways around in the educational arena too. The other example in the last week is that I got a message from an email from a cybersecurity awareness officer who had found a blog of mine, and she'd read that. It wasn't about gamification, but we caught up for a Zoom chat, just an informal conversation. And she makes a lot of media internally for the university, you know, looking to make people aware about cybersecurity and all these different issues around it. And she's thinking about, how could I apply gamification in that setting? How can I engage people? Because people get dozens, hundreds of emails throughout the week that you can kind of only skim through, even if you are hugely invested in doing so. So there's just a couple of examples that people really do see fundamental problems. And I have to admit that while I'm not the dystopian type who will say, you know, the short attention span, I like to think of divided attentions and things like that these days, but arguably, I don't think there's much argument that those crises of engagement have become an even greater problem as time has gone on, even in the last several years since I've started to look at gamification in all those areas. So, yeah.
And I think, as you said there, it's not about the fact that we can't concentrate or we can't focus or engage. It's just the volume, the breadth of information that we have available to us that we're being asked to engage with. Then something like gamification can be a fantastic tool to really break through, stand out, give people that extra motivation, as long as they see value in it, to engage, which is pretty powerful in the climate we're in.
Now we're starting to sound like we're a little bit utopian about gamification potentially. So it's I guess the last point to draw out of that little short clip is that it's not all good news. Gamification, like social media, being the comparison there, can be used in negative ways for negative things. So there's a lot of controversies around gamification. We'll go into those in more depth in later episodes, no doubt. But just to sort of gesture to one, and this is probably one of the main ones, it's that how much is consumer capitalism going to encroach into that gamification space and use things? I mean, we've seen it for years from McDonald's monopoly and so on, and you know, we know that they still do that. And that can be a savvy business strategy. So there's debate around that. The interesting one that's popped up in recent years, which you probably know more about than me, is that collectibles, and they've got different names and they've morphed over time from the supermarkets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as you said, both Woolworths and Coles have their own versions, and it seems to be a mainstay now. There's been some controversy over different elements of the collectibles at different times. Sometimes it's been about the plastic content in them. Sometimes it's been around direct marketing to kids. I have seen that some of that feedback or pushback from the public has prompted particularly Woolworths to rethink the way that the sorts of collectibles that they promote. For example, at the moment, it's the garden, the seedlings that they're giving out. So yes, there's a risk that, in one way, it can be a really effective marketing strategy. And certainly, as any parent knows, having your child beg you for something is probably the strongest form of marketing. And that's what companies do know that. So they seek to really exploit that in a lot of ways. But I think we've all seen some other examples, I suppose, of companies in various emails and various strategies where companies will offer points for certain things. They might try to develop a gamified approach to rewarding customers for things. But at the same time, as you said, the downside is sometimes you can see that there's not much depth behind a strategy like that. So awarding points to a customer when they don't really see the value of that in the end, if there's no strong connection between what those points mean in the end, what you can claim for them, etc., it can, potentially have a negative effect. I suppose at best it might make no difference at all. But thinking that gamification can solve any problem with engagement or can increase engagement is a little too simple. It has to be done well, it has to be thought through, and it has to be value there for the audience, which is something we talk about in social media as well.
Yeah, those concierge systems have just such a dirty name these days. When you feel like it's just, you just want my email address and phone number to send me more messages. Yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, those collectibles, it's interesting you mentioned the direct marketing to young people. And that's another point, I guess, that wasn't in that clip, is that gamification, like gaming, and the statistics are really bearing this out, are not just for, adolescent boys, number one. We've already seen that, lots of women like to game, and girls. But also that all different ages can be engaged, because I think back to that collectibles. I quite often feel compelled, obligated to collect these things for my niece and nephew who live in the Gold Coast. When I see them in 6 to 12 months, I'll hand these things over. And sometimes, I tell my niece on the phone, I've got you some extra stickies or whatever they were called. I don't know what they were. And she said, I've already got 4 sets from Nana, my sister's mother-in-law. Has probably gone to the supermarket countless times just to try and get extra sets. And she gives 4 entire sets to them. And my sister had taken the kids to, they were like market sort of meetings where you would line up to swap things. And my sister just swapped a couple in the line and didn't wait the 20 or 30 minutes to get to the front. It's bizarre, but it shows the power of it. So it's, we'll talk about lots of different examples throughout this podcast, no doubt. And please do let us know your own experiences. You can find us very easily online. We'll draw this episode to a close, but we look forward to, catching up with you online, and, do feel free to subscribe. I'm Digital Zones on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok.
And I'm Emily Grace Wade on Twitter, and Emily G. Wade with some underscores in there on Instagram, but you'll find me online if you head to Twitter.
We'll put all the details in the show notes as well. But thank you so much to listening to the very first episode of Open World Learning. We do a lot of learning by doing, and we're going to discover what this podcast is a lot, I think, just by doing it. And really glad that you could be part of the first little bit. But look forward to making lots more. Thanks, Em, and we'll chat soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.